Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. And welcome to this meeting that we have about the geopolitical volatility amid the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a series of conferences which are given by my colleagues from the ESSEC Business School. So some of them are talking from our headquarters in France, and some of them are talking from Singapore. So I'm based in Singapore. I'm very happy to be with you today in order to talk about that. So talking about the geopolitical volatility is not easy because we can have several ways how to approach it. The first one is, for instance, to use international relations approach. And the international relations approach is very useful in this in this topic because the countries are accountable and they are responsible about what is happening in their own country. And as you know, very recently, we had demands about the accountability for China about what happened there, not necessarily concerning the origin of the virus, but concerning the management and the way how this has been resolved in the country. So for the international relations point of view, we are looking at the different countries, and this is the good way how to approach it, because at the end of the day, they're responsible about what is happening on their own territory. The problem that we have concerning international relations is that we also have to approach the countries which are not members of the United Nations. And in that case, we are talking about Taiwan, because Taiwan has sent a certain number of information to the WHO, but the WHO could not respond since Taiwan is not member of the United Nations and the associated bodies. The other approach is area studies. So area studies means that we can look at a certain number of countries together in order to identify how do they respond to the pandemic. And we can talk about one Asian response, we can talk about an American response, African, European, whatever. What happened during this pandemic, unfortunately, is that we didn't have many, I would say, multilateral and collective approaches for this. And unfortunately, all countries were scrambling in order to find a solution for themselves. And we had also this very ugly situations where they were some countries were closing borders because they were believing that this way they will stop the virus coming to them, or even trying to get some masks from the tarmac of the airports, even if the mask has been scheduled for another country. So it means that from the area studies point of view, we didn't have too many examples of a collective approach how to tackle the virus. The third possibility how to link the geopolitics and the pandemic is to look at the development studies. Development studies is present in many Western countries when they want to separate two groups of countries. On one side, we have developed countries and we have developing countries. And the question is to know, do we have one common approach for the developed countries and another approach concerning developing countries? And it proves that so far we don't have this same thing as for the area studies. The fourth possibility is to look at it through the ideological lenses. So far, we have the great majority capitalist countries, and we have very few communist countries, and including China, of course. So the question is to know how to manage a pandemic if we have a communist government, or how to manage a pandemic if you have a capitalist or a liberal government. Are the differences between them? So this is the ideological lenses, but since we don't have many countries on the communist side, it will be difficult to use it. Why do I talk about that? It is because we can have the approach that we want concerning the geopolitical volatility of the COVID-19. And it is up to all professors, it is up to anyone to say, okay, I prefer to use this one or to use another one. So it means that there is a problem of prioritization. And in order to start the discussion for today, I will make a reference to two very recent developments. The first one is that Wuhan has declared 2 days ago that the last patients were leaving hospital after months-long struggle against the coronavirus. So it means that Wuhan, which is considered to be the epicenter of the coronavirus, is now free of coronavirus. And obviously, from the Chinese point of view, it is the result of a very long and very tough battle against the coronavirus. However, it doesn't mean that we can forget what is happening in the other countries. Because when we are looking at what is happening in the other countries, we are passing the mark of 3 million infected people and more than 300,000 people dead in the other countries. So when we put together there's two things, that is, Wuhan has been freed from coronavirus on one side, and on the other side, the coronavirus is still spreading. There is a problematic situation that I will go back to a little bit later on. So this is the first piece of news, which is extremely important. And the second one is that some Western countries are, I would say, now asking China to show its commitment to the international community and to permit the possibility to have an independent inquiry about what happened in China and especially in Wuhan. And this demand is coming from various countries. It is, of course, coming from the United States, but very recently it also has come from Australia. Even the French president, Emmanuel Macron, was saying that there are things that we don't know, what happened in China. So it means that there is, after some months of battling against the coronavirus, it seems that there is a time that some countries are asking for accountability. Not only accountability, but also responsibility. So the question is to know, why do they ask about this today? Why didn't they ask about this, let's say, 1 month ago? Or why don't they wait for the end of the pandemic in order to ask those kind of questions? And I see two basic reasons for that. The first reason is that the demand for China to give accounts about what happened in the country is part of the everlasting war that we have between the United States and China since Donald Trump has become the president of the United States. So it means that it is just one piece in the puzzle which is existing and which is the continuation of the trade war that we had between the United States and China. And today it is the WHO, but tomorrow it can be another agency of the United Nations, or it can even be the United Nations itself. So it means that it is part of one, I would say, fundamental disagreement which exists between the United States and China. And the second reason is that since we talk about accountability and since some countries have agreed to ease their situation, meaning to suppress the lockdown, there would be also very hard questions for the governments of these countries. The government of the US, the government of France, the government of Italy, the government of Spain, because people will ask them, how did it happen in our countries? Because I remember, since it is a French school, I remember when the French Ministry of Health at that time, Agnès Buzyn, when she has been asked about the coronavirus, first of all, she was saying it will never happen in France. And second, she insisted on the fact that France has one of the best health systems in the world. And it happens that coronavirus is coming to France, we will tackle this without any problem. So now, in retrospective, when we have hundreds of thousands of people who are infected, and we have dozens of thousands of people who are dead, there would be hard questions also for them. So this is why I believe that the reason why we are asking China the explanation about what is happening in China and how and why do we blame China for what is happening for the coronavirus worldwide. It also has to deal with the internal problems that these countries will have, and probably for some of the world leaders, it is better to blame China rather than to analyze their own mistakes or their own errors. Among the different mistakes, I will just quote two of them, coming from should have been sent to all the different health bureaus in the United States, and it happened that these test kits were not good enough. That they, for the different governments in Western countries, it will be very hard not to give adequate answers to the hard questions, and there would be hard questions because people are asking, how come that this happened in our own countries? We were not ready for that. So we just finished this introduction, and after that, I would like to take on some questions, because for the people who follow my classes, they know that it is a very interactive class, and I'm not used to speak to the camera. I prefer to speak to actual people. So I will take after that a certain number of questions, and this is how we are going to proceed. So we just finished with this demand which is coming from the United States about the WHO, when President Trump has announced that he doesn't want to finance the WHO anymore. This is a very serious question, because there is a consensus among the other countries that without the WHO, we cannot tackle this problem seriously. So this is why they all press the United States to review or to reconsider the decision not to finance WHO anymore. Among the reasons why Donald Trump is saying that they don't want to finance WHO, it is because WHO, according to him, has proven to be inconsistent with the inquiry concerning China. They couldn't go to China in order to check everything which is present there, and they don't believe. And President Trump is the first one. They don't believe that the WHO has answered adequately to the task, and especially to the problem that we have there. So no necessity to finance WHO anymore. What is the problem? The problem is that the United States is the biggest contributor to the WHO. They contribute for about $400 million, while China contributes 10 times less. So according to President Trump, he believes that this kind of question, which is focusing on the financing of the WHO, is not something which is sustainable, because we can also come to the conclusion, if my contribution is the biggest one, I would also want this organization to take into account what I have to say. So this is why he is saying, no, I don't want to pay for the WHO anymore. You have to listen to me more. So what will they do if they don't finance the WHO? Does it mean that they don't want to fight against the coronavirus worldwide? Not at all. And President Trump has indicated, no, we will just fund some other organization. We can fund the Red Cross. We can give more money to USAID. And in that case, USAID will do the job. It doesn't mean that the US will not contribute. Simply, they don't want to contribute to WHO. And they don't want to contribute to WHO because it is part of the big battle that we have today in the multilateral organizations, because these multilateral organizations can be the WTO on one side, but it can also be UN agencies. And it's very interesting to see how the UN agencies work, and especially to see who is at the head of these US agencies. So I compiled all the US agencies, all the United Nations agencies, and it happens that for 4 of them, the Secretary General or the President or the Director General is coming from China. So it is happening for the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO. It is happening also for the International Civil Aviation Organization. It is the same thing for the International Telecommunication Union and for the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the UNIDO. So we have 4 organizations where the top people are coming from China. And from the American point of view, they consider this is not good. This is not sustainable. Or we have to change something there. Well, maybe the Americans didn't want to head this multilateral or this international organizations, but this is what is happening at the end. Now, maybe they are waking up and they are saying, no, we don't want to do this anymore. So this is part of the great battle that we have between China and the United States concerning the hegemony or concerning the dominant position that they can have in multilateral organizations. So it can be in the UN agencies, but it can be also at the WTO. And as you know, in the WTO, there is a frontal attack coming from Donald Trump for the WTO because he considers that China is profiting very much from the WTO, not necessarily because they want to avoid the rules, but it is on the contrary, because they know how to use the rules. And Trump is attacking the WTO for 2 reasons. One of them, for instance, is to say that the WTO is having a group of countries which are considered to be developing countries, and as such, they have a certain number of facilities. And China is part of these developing countries because, and it is quite interesting, within the WTO, it is up to every country to identify what it is. Is it a developing country or is it a developed country? So this is why, from the Trump's point of view, this is something which is highly unacceptable because China will be present there. We may have some Gulf countries which are present there. We can have countries which have nothing to do with the developing world, which are present there. And he says, no, this is something that we cannot accept. And the second thing is concerning the arbitration within the WTO. For instance, let's say that the United States are implementing very high taxes, 50% on aluminum, which is coming from China. What will China do? China can complain to the WTO, and within the WTO, we will have one body, and this body will be the appellate body. In the appellate body, we have 7 judges. 6 of them are not appointed. There is just one judge. And you cannot take a decision without having at least 3 judges within the appellate body. And today, the United States is blocking the appointment of new judges. So it means that the United States can impose taxes that they want, and no one can contest because the appellate body within the WTO doesn't work. So I just want to finish this introduction by saying that the geopolitical volatility about the COVID-19 is extremely high, and that something which used to be only a trade war, meaning we were only talking about the business between the United States and China, is now morphing into something else. Because now we have much more countries which are involved in this. And it will be interesting to see how the Western countries will behave. For Australia, it is practically sure that they have opted definitely for the United States. Even if China represents by far the biggest trading partner for Australia, they have chosen the United States in this war concerning coronavirus. And it will also be interesting to see how the UK will react, because the UK has, let's say, a different approach in the past concerning China, passing from very cold to very hot. Now we have to see what they are going to do, and especially concerning Germany and France. Are they also going to support the United States in their demands against China or not? So these are the questions that we will have in the future, because more and more countries are involved in the dispute. It is no more China against the United States. It seems to be more and more the Western world on one side and China on the other side. And the second thing is that we don't talk about trade. We don't talk necessarily about money, or we will talk about money if the responsibility of China comes as a very important one. For instance, if it happens that the blame game succeeds, and that some countries accuse directly China of being responsible. With responsibility, you also have compensation. Today, for instance, in the United States, they have earmarked about $2 trillion to cope with the effect of the COVID. Japan has earmarked $1 trillion. For the other countries, we don't know exactly, but according to IMF, if we take all the different countries together, we talk about $10 trillion. So if someone is going to see China and tell China, you're responsible for this, and now you have to pay $10 trillion, wow. It will be very difficult to imagine that China will say yes. It is quite impossible. So this is why today, when we have some states in the US, such as Missouri, attempting to sue China, this has zero possibility of succeeding, because one country cannot sue another country. And this is not part of any international convention. However, putting pressure is something else, or imposing sanctions, it is also something else. In the past, the United States have already imposed sanctions on some Chinese companies. And it is not only Huawei. Before that, it was ZTE. So the sanctions on ZTE and now the sanctions on Huawei are showing that the United States is not short of possibilities how to impose sanctions on Chinese entities. So maybe in the future, we will also have another set of sanctions. So far, it is a trade war, but maybe in the future, it will be an embargo or it will be sanctions. So I would propose that I am stopping talking for the moment, and I am taking a certain number of questions. I have some questions here on the chat. So now I have to read what is written here. So it is not easy. We have plenty of questions. So I will take, okay. So we have plenty of questions concerning economic situations and concerning the supply chain. And you're right to mention this, because what happened so far is that with the trade war, Donald Trump wanted American companies to reshore to the United States in order to bring them back to the US, to bring jobs back to the United States. So that's quite understandable. However, it was not extremely successful, because the American companies were saying, okay, let's wait and see. Because in November, we will have elections in the US. And if Joe Biden is elected as a president, we have to see what would be his policy towards China. Maybe he will reverse the harsh trade war that we had with China so far. So maybe the American companies, especially the biggest companies, are saying, let's wait and see what is happening there. We will not destroy the supply chain for the moment because of the trade war. So that was the situation before January. The COVID has changed it a little bit. In fact, the companies will not leave China because of the COVID, but the conjunction of the trade war, especially if the trade war continues, and the COVID at the same time, this is having a profound impact on what is happening in the country. And today, we have, for instance, Japan, which has engaged a specific budget for Japanese companies that want to leave China and go back to Japan. And maybe we will have the same thing for the other countries. We have our friends and our colleagues in Vietnam, and I'm discussing with them, especially people who are engaged in supply chains and logistics, and they are telling me that there is a great interest which is coming from Japanese and Korean companies to leave China and to go to Vietnam. Not very much from American companies, because usually they will have this wait-and-see policy, but from the Japanese and from the Korean companies, definitely. The last point that we have concerning the supply chain is that, of course, this will also become a political issue. The political issue is to say we cannot depend on one unique country for our strategic products. If I consider that medicine, all medical products are considered to be strategic, I cannot depend on one country. Would it be China? Would it be the US? Would it be Australia? We don't mind. We cannot depend on just one country. So I presume that in the future, when all this is going to be over concerning the COVID, we will have plenty of reconsiderations about the industrial policy in Western countries, where they will have to come up with priorities, or what they call today essential activities. I like this term, essential activities, because it is not a term that we used before, but today this is the main term that we have today. So they will probably try to identify what are the essential activities, what are the priorities that they would like to have in the future, and how can we be sure that we don't depend on one country. In fact, there could be one possibility, and this possibility has been already explored by a certain number of governments. It is a nationalization or a partial nationalization of some companies. And if you have a nationalization of the company, we have to reconsider the KPIs, the key performance indicators. So maybe profit will not be the most important one. Maybe the stability of the supply chain for the country will be the most important one. So this is why this question about the supply chain is a very interesting one. On one side, we have the private interest. So the American companies are usually waiting what is happening in order to be sure if the trade war is continuing or not. But from the political point of view, we can expect definitely that the governments will use some, let's say, socialist ideas like the nationalization in order to be sure that they have the adequate supply of what they believe is essential products. I will now look at another one. Yeah, so I have another question about blaming China and how blaming China is used as a scapegoat. And I think that I mentioned this a little bit before, so I will elaborate it now. And of course, what does it mean for China? So I believe definitely that for many countries, they are afraid about what will happen next when all thing is over. What could be the questions? The questions will be, was the reaction of a certain number of countries adequate to the danger or adequate to the threat? For instance, we had this situation in Sweden where they used a very light lockdown. They didn't close all the companies. They didn't close all the schools. They let people wander. They let people go and socialize, etc. And they believe that the individual responsibility is the most important one. While in many other countries, they have opted for a hard lockdown. So when all this is over, obviously, we will compare the two strategies and we'll see which one is more important or which one has yielded more results or better results than the other one. If all the countries have decided for a lockdown, in that case, we don't have alternative. But with the Sweden example, maybe the alternative exists, so we'll see later on what happened. And the second question to this one is, did some countries overreact to the COVID? Because they will definitely compare. They will compare with some other diseases. They will compare, for instance, with malaria. There was a malaria day last week. So they will compare with all kinds of diseases, now, normal flu, malaria, HIV, anything. And they will say, for any of the others, we didn't lock down. So why did we lock down for this one? So I think that this will be one hard question that people will start to ask after everything is done. So of course, we can say that we saved so many people, so how can we even ask this kind of question? But we can be sure that there would be some politicians or there would be some opinion leaders who will ask this question. And second question is, how did we manage the delicate situation that we have today? So, and especially concerning the timeline, what happened with the mask? We used to say that the masks were not important, and suddenly the masks are becoming very important. We used to say we did not need to test everyone, and now we are saying maybe it will be good to test as many people as possible. So it means that the politicians cannot always hide behind the so-called scientific reason, because all of them are surrounded by the scientists. But at the end of the day, the politicians are taking the measures. The politicians are taking responsibility. The scientists, they don't take the responsibility. They have not been elected in order to take this kind of decision. So there would be probably two questions. One is, did we overreact? And the second one, how did we manage this? And probably this is something which is very fueling the search for the scapegoat of accusing China. So the accusation of China is another story, but for the Western countries, probably this is how they are going to do it. I'm looking at another question here. Okay, so concerning the sanctions, well, can we sanction China? A very difficult question. We can say the country is so big, no one can sanction China. Or the country will react so vehemently that because of the reaction, we cannot sanction China. But we used to have in the past similar situation, no, not similar situation because it was not a pandemic, but we had a problem in Ukraine, and the Western countries did not hesitate to sanction Russia. Russia is also a nuclear power. Russia is also a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, and the Western countries did not hesitate to sanction Russia. So far, China has never been sanctioned. since the beginning of the People's Republic of China. So it is very hard to imagine that this can happen. However, in the future, this can happen because today we are sanctioning entities from China. So maybe next step will be something else. It was interesting to see how Missouri is suing. Of course, Missouri is suing China as a country, but it is also suing the Communist Party of China. It is also suing certain laboratories in Wuhan. So if we say that one sovereign country cannot sue another sovereign country, Missouri is saying that the Communist Party is accountable, and the Communist Party is not a country, or the laboratories can be accountable, and the laboratories are not the country. So the question about sanctions, I think, is just at the beginning, because there would be pressure from Western countries to try to find a scapegoat, to try to find the responsible, whatever the price it is, in order, of course, to hide their own incompetence sometimes, but also because sometimes they generally believe that China has something to hide, and it is time now to find out what really happened in Wuhan or elsewhere in China. I'm looking at another question. Yeah. So about the unethical approach, which is coming from the United States. So, of course, so far we are using the term the United States, but in fact we are mainly talking about the President Trump. So the question is to know, can we adequate the action of President Trump to the action of the United States? And there are many people in the US who would oppose this. And maybe you remember that when he was elected, there were many people who were having waging protest, and they were saying, "Not in my name." And they were saying, "You are not my president." So it means that they are rejecting even the idea that Trump could represent America. However, in international relations, we have to accept who is the legitimate representative of one country. And because of the many, I would say, because of the many situations where President Trump didn't show, I would say, a flawless attitude. For instance, the Russia Gate, or the attacks against Joe Biden, or attacks against some other people, and his massive use of Twitter. It is also fueling a sentiment, a feeling among people that maybe Trump is manipulating a little bit social media or media in general. So the traditional media are considered to be completely opposed to him. But for the social media, the situation is a little bit different because his activity, his frantic activity on Twitter is compensating for his, let's say, non-presence or bad presence in traditional media. So since he is very much using the social media, and since his record with the intelligence in the United States is not the best one, we are also wondering what is happening there, and how come that we are talking about this laboratories in Wuhan, where maybe the virus is coming from. Maybe we will have all the stories which are coming from his own activity and his own sometimes unethical behavior. And in that case, how can we trust this kind of person when he is accusing China of doing something? So this is also one dark side that we can mention here, because we are not so sure about what is happening there. So, okay. What would be the impact concerning the other ASEAN countries? Because I already mentioned the case concerning Vietnam. I will just refer to one report, and this report has been made by a consultancy agency called A.T. Kearney, and A.T. Kearney has made a wonderful job talking about the possibility of decoupling and reshoring from China. And they have analyzed a certain number of countries who will benefit if the companies leave China. Where will these companies go to? And the reason why I'm talking about Vietnam is that because A.T. Kearney has identified Vietnam as the main beneficiary of the decoupling or reshoring coming from China. And after that, we have India. And after that, we can have Malaysia, we can have Taiwan, we have other countries, but Vietnam is definitely the most important one. Now, concerning the other countries, and especially in this southern part here, concerning Singapore, concerning Indonesia, etc., we are a little bit far away from China. So it means that moving some facilities or manufacturing facilities from China to Indonesia is highly improbable for many reasons. Moving them also going to another country, such as Myanmar, for instance, would also be highly improbable for the moment. Today, the country which is the best target because of the infrastructure, and by infrastructure, I mean physical infrastructure, but also regulatory infrastructure, this country is Vietnam. So Vietnam has this possibility. Taiwan is also very well placed, especially for all Taiwanese companies which are present in China, and maybe they will go back to Taiwan now. So this is also an interesting situation. However, we cannot forget the fact that China is an extraordinarily dynamic market. And if you want to leave China, well, it means that you have to think twice about leaving such a big market, because I don't know any other market which has progressed so fast in the past, and all companies would be interested to be present there. And by the way, when Australia has asked the WHO to investigate in China, immediately the Chinese ambassador in Canberra in Australia has answered, and he has indicated, please think twice. We will not launch a boycott against Australia, but maybe the Chinese population will spontaneously start to boycott Australia. And so far, China is the biggest trading partner for all countries that we have in Asia-Pacific. So please think twice when you're launching this kind of action against China. China is not without possibilities for retaliation, so they will probably have to think twice about that. I'm just looking, what about the situation in Africa? Very interesting question, because if we are looking at the figures, except for Northern Africa, for Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a disproportionately low number of infected people. Why so? One explanation could be we don't have so many infected people. The second explanation could be we didn't test them. So it means that they are, but we simply don't know that they have been infected by the COVID. So the situation in Africa is very problematic, because all these countries are very much indebted. And for many of them, China is the first creditor. So in the West, the IMF, and especially the French president, has asked to rebalance or to restructure. By restructure, we mean that you are wiping out a certain number of debts for Africa. So it seems to be a very interesting idea, because we all know that African countries cannot fight by themselves, alone. against the coronavirus. And if they are so indebted, it means that they cannot put so much money in order to fight against the coronavirus. But it means also that China has to participate. So far, China has lent about $135 billion to African countries, especially Eastern African countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, etc. So it means that for them, China is the biggest creditor. And if China does not participate in this action does not exist. So again, we also have to think twice when we blame China. Let's imagine that we are introducing sanctions against China. This is highly improbable. But let's imagine that we are introducing sanctions against China. Why would China wipe out debts? They would say, no, we have to keep this money. We need this money in order to fight because we have been attacked by another country. So we cannot just imagine to let this money go. We cannot write it, especially after the COVID. We will also need money in order to reconstruct China itself. China itself, we have more than 130 million people who are coming from the countryside in order to work on the coast in China. 130 million. And there is high probability that many of them will lose their jobs. So it means that China itself will have so many problems after the COVID that it will be hard to imagine that they can simply wipe out $135 billion, which is the debt of Africa towards China. But we can also imagine another scenario. So the other scenario is to say China is a fellow developing country, and as a fellow developing country, it is helping the other countries. And if you really want to help the other countries, in that case, they're saying, okay, let's participate to the restructuring of the African debt. And in that case, we will also show our benign attitude, our goodwill in order to tackle the problem with all countries and not only with the Asian or with the European countries. Just looking. Okay. So sometimes I have problems in reading what is written. Very good question, Olga Magneva. So the question is, what will post-COVID world look like for you? Will we go back to normal as it is an opportunity for changes? Okay. So as you know, today everyone talks about the so-called new normal. We don't know exactly what it is, but there is a consensus to say we cannot go back to normal as it used to be in the past. And we are not short of politicians, of economists, of academics, of opinion leaders. There is a great majority of people who are saying this is a wake-up call. We cannot continue like this. We have to change something. Oh, okay. So I remember that it was the same thing that we used to have concerning the crisis in 2008, when they're saying we cannot continue like this. And what happened? It was even worse. So I would be a little bit cautious for that in order to see what are the fundamentals. As long as we continue to have the same fundamentals, meaning to have private property, meaning to have the rule of law, meaning to have free market, and some kind of globalization, I don't see how things are going to change. The only possibility for things to change and to maybe avoid another catastrophe like this one is that the political leaders decide to change. And even if Donald Trump is considered to be ultra-liberal, he accepted to give money to the Americans, but not to all Americans, only to the non-affluent Americans. So he was giving them $1,200. If you have asked him 3 months ago, can you give $1,200 to the non-affluent Americans? I think that the answer would be no. We cannot accept this. So it means that at this point of time, even if I am not convinced that things are going to change, we also have to take into account what is the duration of the crisis. If we declare that the crisis is over by tomorrow, in that case, I would be sure that things are not going to change. But if you are telling me that some kind of lockdown is going to persist until September, or that we will not have the same supply chains as we used to have in the past, or that the governments are taking participation in some private companies, in that case, things are changing. But I think that the most important thing is the duration of the crisis. Because people, human beings, they're very adaptive and they're ready to accept harsh situations, provided that they believe the people who are guiding them, and on the other side, that it is very short in duration. If there is no trust, and if it is too long, in that case, we can have all kinds of crises. So in that case, I would believe that we cannot go back to normal. But maybe this is also the reason why some countries are rushing to unlock. Even if they have hundreds of deaths per day, they are saying no, because the public opinion is so versatile. The public opinion is so going on the other side that we cannot accept to have this kind of threat and this kind of risk for the future, because we cannot control it anymore. I am looking at another question. How will technological competition between US and China evolve due to the pandemic? Very good question. Haley Lim. So this question is going back to the previous element that I mentioned before concerning the fundamental disagreement between the United States and China. And we had, until 2016 and the election of Trump, everyone believed that the globalization was irreversible and inevitable. That's okay. But after him, we had the 4 new words. So we have deglobalization, we have decoupling, reshoring, and the last one that I will use here is bifurcation. So bifurcation means it is the extreme situation where the two countries or the two economies are decoupling. So they don't cooperate anymore. Okay, this can happen. But it means also that both countries are establishing their own systems, their own standards. So it means that, for instance, if you take the Huawei smartphone, on this Huawei smartphone, you won't have American applications. You will only have Chinese applications, and vice versa. So it means that if you want to get in touch with the people who are in China, more than 1.3 billion people who are in China, you cannot use Apple. You cannot use Samsung. You must use ZTE, Xiaomi, must use Huawei or another Chinese provider. And I remember when the Prime Minister Lee from Singapore has been asked about that. And he was absolutely right to say, we don't want to choose between the United States and China. However, if this happens, in that case, we will all have 2 smartphones. You will have one smartphone for the Western world, and you will have another smartphone for China, because there would be incompatibility between them. In the past, we used to have this bifurcation with 2 completely different systems within the Cold War. So we had Soviet Union and we had the United States. And by the way, in the 60s, Soviet Union was even, at the beginning, it was even better than the US, especially concerning the space race. Only after 1989, with the space station Mir, there was a possibility to put them together. But before that, they were completely independent. They were completely separate. And it was impossible to make any compatibility between them. So this is not something which is good for anyone, because it means that you work in two completely separate systems. And when you work in completely separate systems, it may happen that the transparency, it may happen that the democratic way, the privacy, is not respected. So it is better when we have just one. But if it happens that there is a decoupling or a bifurcation, if this happened, let's say, 15 years ago, I would say that for China, it will be very difficult to fight against the US. But today, in 2020, the situation is different. So today, I think that China has the possibility to raise up to the challenge if the challenge is posed by the United States and telling China we have not only to decouple, but we have to bifurcate. And this bifurcation is the extreme version of decoupling. So, another question from Homayun Niknam. Will this pandemic change our view on individual liberties? Very good question. Very good question, especially concerning the tracing apps. As you know, in many countries, tracing apps are considered to be one very efficient way how to fight against the coronavirus, because it is giving us the possibility to track all the people that we have been in touch with, even without our knowledge. So from the technological point of view, I think that it is a very interesting and useful device. It is permitting to fight against the virus. Okay. On the other side, we have clearly a problem concerning privacy, because it means that we are collecting all the data. It means that we know where you have been. We know who are the persons you were in touch with. We know everything about you. So this is why in France, they are planning to ease a little bit the lockdown, starting with the 11th of May. And for the 11th of May, they are talking about the tracing app in France, but they are still not at ease concerning this tracing app, precisely because of the questions which are pertaining to privacy. And so far in France, we don't have this tracing app, even if we have tracing apps in the other countries. So maybe we'll have one up to the 11th of May, maybe later on, maybe never, because in many countries, the question of privacy is paramount. It means that it is more important than the fight. Why so? Because they are saying the fight against the coronavirus will end at some time. But once you start to give up privacy, it will never stop. This is why they are saying, no, we should not have this kind of situation. I will take maybe one last question, because it is practically 1 hour that we have a presence here. So I'm taking one. The last one is coming from Gagandeep Kohli. Religious places are all about gathering of people, etc. Okay. So religious places, very interesting. We could have one session only about that, because when I'm reading what is happening from some religious places, whatever the religion it is, as you know, the great epidemic situation in South Korea started because of one church and because of the religious gathering in this church. And even today, when we are talking about the Ramadan, the question is to know how should we celebrate Ramadan, meaning should we have this groups of people coming together and sharing the iftar or not? So many people would say, no, we have to look at safety first. So we have to change our habits. But there are people who are saying no. And they are using a very interesting explanation for that. They're just saying, only God decides who is going to die or not. So whatever I do, it is not in my own hands. So in that case, I can do whatever I want, and God will either protect me or not to protect me. So we also have to take into account this kind of situation, especially in countries where maybe it is more difficult to trace what is happening, and where it is not easy to say you have to follow this only for safety reasons. It means that you have to convince people what is good for them, and that's not easy for some religious gatherings. I'm really sorry, but we have to stop this discussion. So I think it has been recorded, so you can look at it later on. I prefer to have people in front of me, and in that case, we can have an actual exchange. But I would like to thank you, all of you, for the numerous questions that I had. And I'm really sorry for not answering all of them, partly because I don't know the answers for everything. And second thing, I couldn't read all the questions because I'm really happy that many of you have accepted to stay for 1 hour and also to ask questions. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in the future.